Hello, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to week 2 of Mental Health Mondays presented by Shift Posts. Today's topic is on building better boundaries, and this is a topic that I am extremely passionate about because I truly believe that by setting boundaries in our lives, we can enhance the quality of our life as well as greatly strengthen the relationships that we have with others. So I'm very excited to be presenting this topic to you today. I hope that you will enjoy the content that we have prepared for you and hopefully can take away some useful tools which will allow you to build better boundaries in your life to support your mental health and overall wellness. Without further ado, let's get into our topic. So, first, we'll start off by defining boundaries. What are they? So, many people have the wrong idea about boundaries. They believe that they already have good enough boundaries when in reality, they have very firm brick walls up, or they believe that boundaries are unkind and therefore don't have any boundaries in their lives at all. And because so few of us understand what boundaries actually are and the power of them, we rarely see evidence of them working. But when we do, you really feel it, and it does wonders for your mental and relational health. So, what boundaries really are limits that you put in place to protect your well being. Boundaries are essentially a life enhancing system of yeses and nos. They're stop signs and borders that you install to protect yourself so that it's very clear that you own your own life, that you're making good choices, and pursuing the most authentic expression of who you are in the ways that you live, love, give, and relate. Boundaries are especially important for ensuring that we do not overextend ourselves and that we are acting and behaving in alignment with our ethics and values. And what's really important is that boundaries are flexible and they evolve over time. So, just like how, as people, we're constantly evolving, we're constantly learning new things and going through different seasons of our lives as we grow and progress from one decade of our life to another, our boundaries will change with us. And I've included a quote that I really love, which I think sums up boundaries quite nicely. And this quote is by Gerard Manley Hopkins. And it says that your personal boundaries protect the inner core of your identity and your right to choices. And I really love that. So let's talk about why boundaries are so important. Well, firstly, boundaries help us to define our sense of identity. So they allow us to become clear and confident with ourselves and allow us to connect to our sense of selves. Secondly, understanding how to set your personal limits through boundaries is essential for building and maintaining healthy relationships. Healthy boundaries are the ultimate guide to successful relationships. Without boundaries, relationships often do not thrive. And sometimes relationships can contain some feelings of resentment, disappointment, or violation. And usually that's because we're not communicating to the best of our abilities. And moreover, we're not communicating what our boundaries are and how we feel about things and why we feel that certain way. And those feelings, all of those negative feelings of resentment, disappointment, violation, those can lead us to feeling cut off from others or misunderstood. So that's something that we want to prevent by establishing strong boundaries. And by doing so, we can connect more deeply with others in our lives and form a sense of understanding. Boundaries also allow us to protect our energy, physical and emotional spaces. This is super important. Our energy is at the core of our essence, right? And if we're feeling that we are depleted and used and overextended, then we become a lesser version of ourselves, right? And we're not able to show up as strongly in our relationships, in work, or even for the things that we love to do in our lives, such as our hobbies. So, by protecting your energy, physical, and emotional spaces with boundaries, we can promote health and decrease stress levels. Boundaries also give us a really powerful space to be able to grow and to be vulnerable. Boundaries allow us to share personal information gradually with others in a very mutually sharing and trusting relationship. Healthy boundaries are also necessary components for self care. Without boundaries, like I said before, we feel depleted, taken advantage of, and taken for granted. We may even feel intruded upon. And boundaries help us to take care of ourselves by giving us permission to say no to things and to avoid overextending ourselves by taking responsibility for more than we can reasonably handle. Boundaries allow us to draw a clear line around what is okay for us and what is not, and allow us to be assertive about our needs and wants. And lastly, boundaries help us to manage expectations clearly, which helps us in two really big ways. Firstly, by establishing what behavior you will accept from other people in your life. And secondly, by establishing what behavior other people can expect from you. That is really, really powerful and important. Next, let's discuss different types of boundaries. So, first, we have physical boundaries. So, these are needs for personal space, your comfort with touch, and your physical needs like needing to rest, eat food, and drink water. It's okay to let people know that you don't want to be touched or that you need more space. And it's also okay to say that you're hungry or that you need to rest. And a lot of us don't take the opportunity to do so. We might think that this is a sign of weakness, but really it isn't. It just comes down to a very simple human need, right? So it's important to note that physical boundary violations might feel like receiving inappropriate or unwanted touch, being denied of your physical needs, for instance, being told to keep walking when you're tired, or maybe they feel like having someone come into your personal space in a way that's uncomfortable, like entering your office or your bedroom without permission, for example. This can vary on a spectrum from mild to severe and affects every person a little bit differently since boundaries are very unique. And it's also important to see what healthy physical boundaries might sound like. So, these are ways in which we can express our physical needs. So, for instance, I've had a hard day at work and I'm really tired. I need to lie down and rest for 30 minutes. I'm not a big hugger. I'm a handshake person. I need to eat. I'm going to go grab something. I am allergic to blank, so we can't have that in our home. My personal space is invaded. Please stand further away from me. Please wear a mask inside when visiting our home to protect our newborn baby. All of those are really great examples of expressing physical boundaries and allowing people to understand what too much is for you and how to respect your personal limits. Number 2, emotional boundaries. Emotional boundaries are all about respecting and honoring feelings and energy. Setting emotional boundaries means recognizing how much emotional energy you're capable of taking in, knowing when to share and when not to share, and limiting emotional sharing with people who respond to you poorly. Respecting emotional boundaries essentially means validating the feelings of others and making sure that you respect their ability to take in emotional information. So, emotional boundary violations might include dismissing and criticizing feelings, asking questions that are not appropriate for the relationship, or that questions that invade someone's personal comfort level. They might look like reading or going through personal and emotional information, like journals or diaries. texts. They might look like asking people to justify their feelings. We have to remember that no is a complete sentence. Emotional boundary violations might also look like assuming we know how other people feel and making judgments or telling other people how they feel. And another big violation of emotional boundaries is emotional dumping on people without their permission. Okay. So now let's take a look at what healthy emotional boundaries might sound like. How can we express those limits? So one example is when I share my feelings with you and get criticized, it makes me totally shut down. I can only share with you if you're able to respond respectfully to me. Or I am having a hard time and really need to talk. Are you in a place to listen right now? Confirming that someone is available and has the capacity and bandwidth to listen prevents emotional dumping. And it also allows us to approach someone when they have the space to respond to us so that we prevent any negative feelings from entering the conversation. So for instance, if someone had a really hard day at work, maybe they don't have the capacity to speak to you about something really big that's going on in your life because they're dealing with a lot in their own space. So it's important to be mindful of that. And that's why it's a very important question to ask. And lastly, I'm not ready to talk about that right now. Can we revisit this subject this afternoon? We have to remember that it's very acceptable to also respect our own time and feelings. And if we aren't in the space to talk to someone else about a problem that they're experiencing, we can also suggest a different time without that being unkind. Next, we have time boundaries. So it goes without saying that your time is very valuable and it's important to protect how it's utilized. Setting time boundaries is incredibly important at work, home, and in social settings. Setting time boundaries essentially means understanding your priorities and setting aside enough time for the many areas of your life without overcommitting to anyone. Okay, that's super important. When you understand what your priorities are and what's important to you, it is so much easier to limit the amount of time that you're giving to other people unnecessarily. Violated time boundaries might look like asking professionals for their time without paying them, maybe demanding time from other people without respecting that their time is valuable. It could look like keeping people in conversations or on tasks for longer than we told them they would. It might look like showing up late or canceling on people because we overcommitted. And it might look like contacting people when they said they would be unavailable. Okay. Now let's look at what healthy boundaries sound like in terms of time boundaries. I can't make it to that event this weekend. I can only stay for an hour. Do you have time to chat today? I would love to help, but I would be overcommitting myself. Is there another time? We have family time on Sundays, so we won't make it. I'm happy to help with that. My hourly rate is blank. Okay. Statements like these allow us to protect our time boundaries and they honor the fact that our time is very valuable. So we shouldn't be afraid to use them in our daily lives. Next, we have sexual boundaries. Healthy sexual boundaries might include consent, agreement, respect, understanding of preferences and desires, and privacy. So, healthy sexual boundaries include asking for consent, discussing and asking for what pleases you, discussing contraception, maybe saying no to things that you don't like or that hurt you, and also protecting the privacy of the other person. Sexual boundary violations might include sulking, punishing, or getting angry if someone doesn't want to be intimate with you. Could look like not asking for consent or a pressure to engage in unwanted sexual acts. Could look like lying about contraceptive use or lying about your health history. It could look like criticizing the other person's sexual preferences. And it can also look like unwanted touch, assault, or rape. Now let's look at what healthy sexual boundaries might sound like. So, for example, I don't like that. Let's try something different. This isn't comfortable for me. Tell me what you like. Tell me what you don't like. I'm really into blank. Is that something that you would feel comfortable with? It's very important to have conversations about our sexual boundaries. Often, sex and intimacy is a very taboo subject, but it's so important to normalize it and to increase the number of conversations that we're having with our partner about what we need and want from them and what our limits are. Next, let's talk about intellectual boundaries. So, intellectual boundaries refer to your thoughts, ideas, and curiosity. And healthy intellectual boundaries include respect for the ideas of other people, and they can be violated when your thoughts and curiosity are shut down, dismissed, or belittled. Respectfulness and willingness to dialogue and understand are important here. And healthy intellectual boundaries also mean considering whether or not it is a good time to talk about something. Does this mean that you have to be accepting of all thoughts and opinions? Absolutely not. It's also important to learn to recognize the difference between healthy and unhealthy discourse. For instance, if someone's sharing an opinion that is inherently harmful, for instance, something that's racist or sexist or homophobic, then you have every right in the world to put a hard line in the sand. You can set the boundary in your own way. It might sound like letting the person know that you do not tolerate that kind of talk, and it might look like distancing yourself from them or cutting them off completely. You do not have to have intellectual discourse with someone who is violating you, your values and ethics, or other people. Okay, so it's a very important thing to mention. Let's talk about what healthy intellectual boundaries might sound like. So here are some examples. I know we disagree, but I won't let you belittle me like that. This might sound a little bit sassy, maybe a little bit aggressive, but you're setting the stage for how someone speaks to you, right? There's this saying that we teach others how to treat us. And if you're uncomfortable with the way that someone is approaching you or how they're handling a conversation with you, and they're making you feel a certain way, you have every right to point that out to them, let them know how you feel, and let them know that you will not tolerate being spoken to in that manner. Okay? So part of setting boundaries is teaching people how to communicate with us, and it goes back to that managing expectations point that I discussed earlier. It's setting a clear stage for what we will accept and what we won't. And if you're clear with someone about your boundaries, you've communicated them in a very transparent manner, and they still choose to violate them, then they are essentially telling you that they do not respect the relationship, and it might be a premise to end the relationship altogether. Okay? Some other examples. I would love to talk about this more, but I don't think talking about it during Thanksgiving dinner is the best time. Totally acceptable. When we talk about this, we don't get very far. I think it's a good idea to avoid the conversation right now. And lastly, I can respect that we have different opinions on this. Okay? And lastly, material boundaries. So material boundaries refers to any items or possessions that we have and also refers to our finances as well. It is healthy to understand what you can and cannot share and how you expect your items and materials to be treated by the people you share them with. Having limits on how your material items are treated is healthy and prevents resentment over time. Okay. Material boundaries are violated when your things are destroyed or stolen or when they're quote unquote borrowed too frequently. Another material violation might be the use of materials such as money or possessions to manipulate and control relationships. Healthy material boundaries might sound like, I can't lend out my car. I am the only person on the insurance. Or, please pay me back by Friday. Or, I don't feel comfortable lending money. I would be happy to help in another way. Or, sure, I'm happy to share my lawnmower with you. Just a heads up, I'll need it back by the weekend. Okay. So now that we've discussed the different branches of boundaries, let's talk about defining boundaries. Where do boundaries come from? For most of us, boundaries will come from different aspects of our lives, and our boundaries are shaped by our heritage or culture, the region in which we live or come from, whether we're introverted, extroverted, or somewhere in between, our life experiences, and our family dynamics. Unfortunately, we can't just search on Etsy for a set of hand knit boundaries to make our own. Boundaries are a deeply personal choice and vary from one person to the next, and we shape them throughout our lives. And you can investigate and define your boundaries with self reflection. We'll go through a few prompts here. So, 3 questions that are really, really important to ask yourself are these. Firstly, what are your rights? Once you identify your rights and choose to believe in them, you'll find honoring them is much easier. When you honor them, you'll stop spending energy pacifying or pleasing others who dishonor them. And it's important to note what your basic rights are, because a lot of us don't acknowledge these or think that we're in the wrong by enforcing these into our lives. Some basic rights are, I have a right to say no without feeling guilty. I have a right to be treated with respect. I have a right to make my needs as important as others. I have a right to be accepting of my mistakes and failures. I have a right not to meet others' unreasonable expectations of me. Okay. Secondly, what does your gut say? Your instincts can help you determine when someone's violating your boundaries or when you need to create a boundary. There's a reason why they say the gut is the second brain. Okay. You definitely want to check in with your body to tell you what you can handle and where a boundary should be drawn. So, paying attention to our heart rate, sweating, tightness in our chest, stomach, or throat allows us to determine when we're feeling uncomfortable, even if our minds don't think so. Our bodies and our minds can be a little bit disconnected sometimes. But the physical signs are very, very telling. So please don't ignore those. And lastly, what are your values? Your boundaries relate to your moral philosophy. I strongly recommend identifying 10 important core values which are incredibly critical to the way that you live your life. And then we can narrow that list down to 5 or even 3. And once you have your 3 most important values, you can reflect on how often those values are challenged, tread upon, or poked in a way that makes you feel uncomfortable. And this lets you know where placing boundaries is necessary. So, some core values, for instance, which may be of importance to you, are things like family, personal development, health and wellness, spirituality, religion, friendship, etc. Okay. And for some of us, it might be a little bit difficult to pinpoint core values. And if you're having a hard time determining what they are, then you can try a little bit of a different exercise instead. I really like this one. So it's essentially starting from the end. And I want you to imagine your future 10, 15, or even 20 years from now. Imagine you're at an event that is celebrating you, your life, and your accomplishments. And imagine that there are to be 4 speakers at this event. The first is from your family. The second speaker is a friend. The third speaker is someone from your work or profession, a colleague or boss. And the fourth is from your place of religious affiliation or a community organization where you have been involved in service. And once you have those 4 people in mind, I urge you to think deeply and think about what you would like each of these speakers to say about you and your life. Okay? So think about what kind of partner, husband, wife, father, or mother would you like to be? What would you like their words to reflect about you? What kind of son or daughter or cousin would you like to be? What kind of friend? What kind of work associate? What character would you like them to have seen in you? What contributions, achievements, successes would you want them to remember about you? What difference would you like to have made in their lives? All very impactful questions. And we ask these questions to develop a personal mission statement. Okay. And our mission statement is something that we don't necessarily create overnight, but something that we have to give a lot of thought to. And once we have it, and this mission statement focuses on what we want to be, our character, and what we want to do, our contributions and achievements, and focuses on the values and principles upon which being and doing those things are based upon. It's much easier to set and maintain boundaries that help to keep you on this path. So I strongly recommend that you do that. It's a very powerful tool that allows us to figure out what's important in our lives and where we want to be. Okay. Next, let's delve into exercising boundaries. So putting our limits into practice. So the first thing that is very important when exercising boundaries is being assertive. If someone sets boundaries with assertiveness, it feels firm but kind to others. Assertive language is clear and non negotiable without blaming or threatening the recipient. Okay. One way to be assertive is to use I statements. So, for instance, I feel blank when blank because blank. What I need is blank. I statements show confidence and good boundary setting by expressing thoughts, feelings, and opinions without worrying what others are thinking. Okay. So let's look at the difference here between effective communication and ineffective communication. So, an example of effective communication: I feel violated when you read my journal because I value privacy. What I need is a space that I know is private to record my thoughts. Ineffective communication is keep your hands off my stuff. You'll notice that in the effective communication, we focused on the feeling. So, feeling violated. How does that impact you? It impacts the value of privacy, right? Recognizing what is needed. So, what I need is space, private space to record thoughts, right? It's not blaming, it's just saying how we feel, what we need, why we need it. Great way of communicating. A second example, I feel overwhelmed when every minute of our vacation is planned. What I need is some downtime just to relax and see what happens. Ineffective communication, on the other hand, is you're making this vacation exhausting and I don't want to do the things you've planned. You'll notice the difference between the two. The first one shares a lot of those qualities that I mentioned with the first example, stating how you feel, why you feel it, what you need. In the second example, it's blaming, feeling like the other person is making the entire vacation exhausting and sort of discounting their efforts in planning activities for the vacation. So, not showing that that effort was appreciated and sort of communicating this feeling that all of the ideas are bad ideas and that you don't want to do any of them, which may not even be the case. Okay. So, using I statements is a very powerful tool. Secondly, we want to learn how to say no. Even though it can be daunting to say no, we have to remember that no is a complete sentence. We might be hesitant to say no without offering more information or an explanation, but really, it's not always necessary. Sometimes assertiveness isn't needed for boundary setting as much as personal tolerance for being uncomfortable. I'll say that again. Sometimes assertiveness isn't needed for boundary setting as much as personal tolerance for being uncomfortable. Okay? You can totally say no without an explanation and without providing any emotional labor to the person you're saying it to. Okay? So don't be afraid to use this very powerful 2-letter word. Okay? Lastly, safeguarding our spaces is so important. You can set boundaries for your stuff, physical and emotional spaces, and your time and energy without necessarily announcing it. Okay? New research shows that we should take the time to tune out. And one recently published study reports that just the expectation that we should be available to answer work email during non-work time frames can decrease our well-being and create conflict in our relationships. You may have heard that in Ontario, a bill was recently passed which allows employees to have the right to disconnect, so that bosses aren't contacting workers at inappropriate times and invading that work-life balance. So that's a really great movement that was passed. Our tech spaces are an incredibly important area for boundary crossing concern, especially in romantic partnerships. Technology has quickly paved the way for an invasion of privacy and control. And more than half of respondents in a recent survey reported that communication technology was used in their intimate relationships as a mean to monitor or manipulate. As an adult, you have the right to secure your personal tech and accounts and to keep your messages private. Communicating boundaries with new partners about our digital devices is a habit that we should all develop and enforce. So let's talk about ways that we can safeguard our spaces. So, firstly, scheduling non negotiable alone time. Having your own personal space is so important. Maybe you just want to sit alone one evening away from your partner, just watching a TV show on your iPad. That is totally okay, and it's completely acceptable to communicate that boundary to your partner and let them know why you need that space. Another way is by using passwords, codes, or other security features on devices and tech accounts to protect our privacy. Another way is by setting a cutoff time for answering emails or texts. So, for instance, after 10 p.m., letting your friends and family know that you'll be winding down for bed, you won't be looking at your phone anymore, and that if they hope to reach you, they should send you an email or text before 10 p.m., unless, of course, there's an emergency. Using the out of office responder on email accounts when on vacation is a great way of setting a boundary. It communicates the idea to other people that you respect and value your time, your personal time, and your time off. Another way is by asking staff or colleagues not to contact you outside of regular business hours. Sending verification of your time off days in advance to any colleagues. And lastly, using the Do Not Disturb feature on your phone or other devices as needed. And lastly, asking for assistance or support. So, a lot of us have a very difficult time asking for help, but it's an incredibly important aspect of our mental health and well being. So, we should not be afraid to ask for help when we feel overwhelmed. We should be welcome to asking a loved one to support us in asserting our boundaries. And we can also ask for advice on what to do if someone in our lives is violating or disrespecting our boundaries, to gather their perspective and their thoughts on the situation, and to also encourage them to assert your boundaries if necessary. Let's talk about recognizing and honoring others' boundaries. Having a traffic light to guide us in asserting boundaries would be very helpful. However, we can tap into other ways of being mindful and not overstepping. It all comes down to communication and being aware of other people's space. So, here are 3 beginner rules to follow when we recognize and honor others' boundaries. The first is watching for cues. Noting social cues is a great way to determine another person's boundaries. And some possible hints that someone might want more space includes if they're avoiding eye contact, turning away or backing up, limiting conversation response, using excessive nodding or uh-hing, if their voice suddenly becomes higher pitched, if they're making nervous gestures like laughing, talking fast, or speaking a lot with their hands, folding their arms or creating a closed or stiffening posture, and flinching or wincing. Next, we want to be inclusive of neurodiverse behaviors. Neurodivergent is a newer term used to describe people who live with autism, are on the spectrum, or who have other developmental disabilities that might result in affecting the way that they communicate and react to social situations. Their social cues might be a little bit different from the norm, such as poor eye contact or difficulty starting a conversation. So it's important to keep in mind that some people might use certain gestures all the time, might not provide any cues, might have different cues, or might not pick up on the subtleties of your social cues. These are all very important things to keep in mind when dealing with other people, dealing with patients, for instance, and just being mindful of that. And lastly, asking. Never underestimate the power of asking. You can always inquire if someone feels comfortable speaking about a certain subject. You can ask if a hug or a handshake is okay, or you can ask for permission to ask a personal question. Asking allows us to determine what other people's boundaries are without making them feel super uncomfortable or invading their personal space. So, in summary, healthy boundaries allow us to have high self esteem and self respect, to share personal information gradually in a mutually sharing and trusting relationship, to protect physical and emotional space from intrusion, to have an equal partnership where responsibility and power are shared, to be assertive, confidently and truthfully say yes or no, and to be okay when others say no to you, to separate our needs, thoughts, feelings, and desires from others, to recognize that our boundaries and needs are different from others, and to empower ourselves to make healthy choices for ourselves. Setting boundaries isn't always comfortable, and people may push back if you say no to some things or try communicating your needs more clearly and transparently. People might try to test your limits to see how serious you are about drawing the line, or they might be used to you responding in a certain way, maybe a more passive way, or maybe you're the type of person who agrees to take on everything. And then they might be a little bit resistant and push back when you try to make some changes and to be more assertive of yourself. But that doesn't mean that you're doing anything wrong. It just means that you need to be clear and, most importantly, consistent until other people adjust to the new way of interacting. Okay. Ultimately, boundaries are meant to help us. Like I said, they can be a life-changing tool that we can use to transform our relationships with ourselves, with others, and to enhance our quality of life. The more that we set boundaries, the more that we recognize them, and in setting boundaries, we help people show up for us. We also become better at showing up for them. And overall, everyone wins, right? And I've included a little quote here, "The Clear is Kind" by Brene Brown, who is a incredible researcher who studies vulnerability and does a lot of research on boundary setting. I strongly recommend that you check out some of her TED Talks on YouTube if you're interested in learning more about boundaries. I've also included some useful tools in the handout section for boundary setting. So, some handouts and some worksheets that you can work through and utilize if you'd like to explore your boundaries further and learn more about this topic. And with that, we are at the end of our presentation. And I want to say thank you so much for joining me this evening. I hope that you enjoyed the content of this presentation. I hope that you learned something today, and that setting boundaries is a useful tool that you can take with you throughout your life to become more confident in yourself and in your relationships. On behalf of everyone at Shift Posts, thank you for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. I hope to see you here for our next session, and take care.